Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your flexibility in being in the chapel. We have the All Saints Sunday Remembrance service going on in the parlor in the columbarium today. And some of our folks are over there, which is why they're not here. But we get in this bigger room and we sort of spread out, and here we are. So I will say this one thing from our previous experience when we had to be over here. I want to encourage discussion as usual, but do remember that if you speak, please sort of bend your head into the middle of the room and speak up. That would be great to help everyone with that. So it's hard to hear what's spoken in the middle of the room because of the acoustics in here. All that could be solved for somewhere between $500,000 I alone, like the prophet, have been begging for a renovation of the chapel. But I digress. A couple of announcements before we get started today. One is there's a list out on the table there in the hallway if you would like to sit at a Discovery class table at the Thanksgiving luncheon on November 24th. Sign up for that. If you would like to pay for that, you can either drop that money. I guess maybe today with me would be the thing. Just mark yourself paid there. I'll turn in the money. And then, just give it to me. That's fine. Or if you'd rather pay at the front desk and just tell them you're on that, we'll get the table set up and all that. We've got several people signed up, and it's a good way to be together there also. There is a blood drive going on today. If you're an eligible and willing blood donor, we would appreciate your support down in Community Hall. Also, there is an event at noon today in the other part of Community Hall. It's a luncheon discussion. It's free on how to have a civil conversation at the Thanksgiving table. If any of you are going to be spending Thanksgiving with family members who see the world completely differently than you do, and you're trying to figure out how you can not choke on the turkey, this is what that's about. Come get some tips. And Andy Stoker, who's the pastor at First United Methodist downtown, who is really well versed in family systems theory, is going to be one of the presenters here talking about how we understand our connections to each other. So it would be a really good event. I encourage you to consider that as well. We'll be back in the parlor next week and on a regular schedule. So for those who are present in the room and live streamers, I've got a handout today. I'd be glad to email it to you if you want to email me, mwingfield@wilshirebc.org, mwingfield@wilshirebc.org, and I will be glad to send this to you. I'm doing something a bit unorthodox today. I'm giving you the entirety of my notes for teaching today. So what I need you not to do is to read it as I say it. There are some extended quotes in there that I will call your attention to, and Donna has an announcement before I get too much deeper into that.
I'm standing up so everybody can hear me. Cody is over at Columbarium in the service there, and she requested that I mention this morning. This is an envelope that says Thanksgiving Food Basket Donation. We'll also have the sacks that we normally do. If you want to take a sack, put your own food in it and bring it here, that's fine, or to the office. But also, we're going to pass this around, and she'll collect this, and she'll take what money is in here, go to places like Aldi or Walmart, buy cases of green beans, and put the baskets, sacks together. So that might be an easy way for you to do it. I know it is for you. So, I'm going to start passing the kid. We've already done how we come down this way. And we just kind of go back and forth. And end up over here with you, Shannon, and Cody, who's sitting right behind you. And give it to her. Yes.
So just to make sure everyone's clear, you can either do your own grocery bag, pick up one, get it filled with the items on the list and bring it, or if you want to not mess with that, you can put money in here and it'll get done for you. Yes? Yes. You can bring it anytime. Mm-hmm. Oh, can you go backward? You just go all the way back.
Oh, I thought you said go.
Yeah. Yes. Or you can do both. Right. All good. All right, so today I'm beginning a several-week series between now and Advent on religious pluralism. Trying to deal with the question of how do we understand the apparently exclusive claims of Christianity in the multicultural world, multi-religious world in which we live today. A lot of implications from that. And so I'm beginning, so on the handout, anything that's indented pretty much is a quote that I pulled from a book called Thinking About Religious Pluralism, Shaping Theology of Religion for Our Times, by a British author named Alan Race. Now, if you go get this book, which I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do, it happens to be a resource that I found that I've been drawing some from, know that this particular book leans toward a highly inclusive understanding of world religions. So it probably would not espouse the view that would be the primary view of folks in this class, but it does have a good discussion of the issues, which is why I pulled some content from it today. Anything else is not from that. We begin today with a quote from the great Jewish sage, who you may have heard quoted here and there in sermons, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a 20th century figure who in the 1960s wrote this little line in the 60s, in this eon, diversity of religions is the will of God. Okay, this is from a Jewish scholar and important figure. In this eon, diversity of religions is the will of God. Now, on its face, that probably is a pretty shocking statement to us. On the other hand, some of you may be clinging to that saying, yes, I've always thought that, but I didn't know how to say it. These indicate for him that no religion has a monopoly on holiness or spiritual insight, and that all religions are a means and not the end. I begin with this because that is going to be one of the poles on a continuum we're going to talk about. Another end of a pole on the continuum that we'll talk about is that the mainstream Christian view that Christianity is the only way to God, and other religions are by default not only different but inferior or incomplete. Do you see where we are here? And one of the points I want to make is that we sort of get to these two poles and we understand that, but there's a lot of variation in the middle and embroidery on the sides of those two things that we could and will talk about. Remember that one of the things Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, teaches is instead of no word being God's last word, as Heschel says, no word being God's ultimate word, we teach generally that Jesus is the final word spoken by God. And I'm giving you an example here. For those of you who've ever followed contemporary Christian music, in its early days, mid-early days, in the 90s, this guy's still around. Michael Card is a recording artist who recorded this song that was a hit at the time. It's called The Final Word, and the lyrics I've given you here, you and me, we use so very many clumsy words. The noise of what we often say is not worth being heard. When the Father's wisdom wanted to communicate his love, he spoke it in one final, perfect word. He spoke the incarnation, and then so was born a son. His final word was Jesus. He needed no other one. Spoke flesh and blood so he could bleed and make a way divine. And so was born a baby who would die to make it mine. This lyric encapsulates very much of mainstream Protestant and Catholic theology on this particular point, and it's one of the things I want us to unpack as we go through this. And this is why this whole notion of religious pluralism is so challenging, because we have been taught and teach that faith in Jesus Christ is the only way to God. And this is what gets us in trouble in interfaith dialogue so much of the time when we insist on that. I've given you some examples of 3 scriptures that I think we will deal with in the coming weeks. You may think of others that are like this as well. John 14:6, the most well-known that probably immediately comes to mind. Jesus is speaking to Thomas and says, Thomas is asking, how will we know where you're going? And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Acts 4:12. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved. And Romans 3:23 and 24. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So just 3 examples of scriptures that seem to point to an exclusivity of Jesus as the mediator, as the way for us to find access to God and to heaven. I'm going to pause here and ask, can you think of other scriptures that come to your mind that would be in this vein as well? Anyone? Something just popping in your head? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. What else? If you confess with your mouth Jesus Christ is Lord, you will be saved. Right, then you'll be saved. It is.
And then all they that call upon his name.
All they who call upon his name will be saved, right? So here's a challenge. I'm going to be devil's advocate as well as explainer today. I must have stepped in the wrong place here. I'm getting echoey. Here is the challenge that I want you to think about as we consider any of these verses. One of the questions we've got to ask is, do those verses, taken at face value, point to an exclusive nature of Jesus, or point to simply the way to God through Jesus? So, let's take John 3:16, for example. I'm not going to get too deep in the scripture today. That's really going to be next week. But I want you to understand what I'm saying. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Seems to describe a way to God through faith in Jesus Christ. It does not say there's no other way to God. Right?
Right. But I remember asking you one time, what do you think about the person who says, Jesus isn't the only way, he's just the fastest or quickest, and you didn't really like that?
Shannon says, she asked me one time, well, how do I respond to someone who says, Jesus isn't the only way to God, he's just the fastest and quickest. And I said I didn't like that too much. Yeah, so hold that thought, because we're going to get to that very idea here. Cody?
I thought a long time ago that it seems that that people don't think about that. It's so simple to come to Christ. I mean, not so simple, but you just ask and receive. And I think that's the worst or best thing about Christianity, because people are scared of it, or afraid of it. Okay, I said it now, and I will.
So Cody says the best and worst thing about Christianity is it's so simple.
Right.
Right?
To accept it.
I was going to say John 14:6 is pretty exclusive, though.
Yes, it is. And we're going to get into a deeper study of that next week. I'm trying to set the table for you today. Shannon and then Marilyn.
What about the line, and I'm pretty sure it was from George, I could be wrong about that. Why would God limit us in one way of knowing?
Shannon remembers George saying at some point, why would God limit us in one way of knowing? Fair enough. And let me say, by the way, I am not making a case for anything right now. Before you run me out of the chapel as a heretic, I'm going to be playing devil's advocate with all of this. Marilyn, and
I just have a hard time believing that that's it because of the relationship, I've had with the Jewish
right.
Emmanuel and the people there, and they are strong believers in God.
So our relationship with people of other faiths shapes our understanding of what may be going on there. And that's an excellent point. We're going to get back to that too. Yes?
Being a child of the 60s, this makes so much sense because there's a lot of people out there. You cannot hammer everybody into the same mold and hope to save very many people.
So you cannot hammer everybody into the same mold and hope to save many people. That's a good thought, yes?
Well, I just want to add, because honestly, currently I work in a school with very multi-religious, and it's very obvious to most people that, for the most part, except for a few conversions here and there, most people grow up in a religion and that's what they learn to believe because that's the way they were raised. But I still strongly believe that Jesus is the only way, but what I am open to and believe is that belief and a relationship with Jesus may not be the only way. There may be something else that happens, even post-death or whatever.
Yeah.
That he may truly be the path to God and he may truly be the Son of God, but maybe it's not just dependent on our relationship here. Our relationship here is more about the way we live and serve here.
Excellently said. And let me just warn you that in a little bit, I'm going to get to a C.S. Lewis quote that is going to blow your mind. Let's start here with Carla.
I saw another quote, 1 Thessalonians 5:9. God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ.
Excellent. Okay.
This brings up the idea to me about the Native Americans, the Indians that believe in Mother Earth.
Right.
Yeah, it was a spiritual relationship with them.
So Native American religion, and one of the ideas here that we have to wrestle with is it possible other people know our God by a different name? Right? Yes. And Allah being an example of that. Okay? Excellent. Now we got you in the spirit of all this. For most of us as Christians, the exclusive nature of Christianity as the way to God is just a given and we never question it. However, with the growing influence of religious pluralism in the world today, we sometimes are faced with more conversation. I think that's the root of why we even have this conversation. But let me say this. Is there really more religious pluralism in the world today, or are we just more aware of it? Part of what's happened, if you think about this, is that within the past 50 years, there's been a tremendous shift in, I'll use the political word globalism, but the sociological phenomenon is global migration. So that if you think about my childhood, growing up in the 60s and 70s, most of the ways I knew about other parts of the world and other cultures was one of three things. It was either through National Geographic, Disney movies, or missionary speakers. Right? I mean, many of you, like me, grew up in a culture where the greatest window we had into other cultures was through the missionaries who would be home on furlough and come speak in our churches. Right? And maybe we were in missions organizations as a kid, RAs and GAs, and here we have Globe Trekkers, and I've taught Globe Trekkers here with kids, where we teach them about other parts of the world, right? I remember as a kid, my parents had signed, I'm a spoiled only child, right? So my parents had signed me up for this, shocking, right? my parents had signed me up to get this, it was like a once-a-month kit from National Geographic that came with some trinket, or it came with information about some country. And one of the things that I vividly remember was a panpipe, a bamboo panpipe, right, that you could sort of learn to play, that came in this neat little box, and it taught me about whatever Indonesia or wherever that was from, right? So between that and going to church, that was what shaped my view of the world. This was growing up in extreme white bread central Oklahoma, where, as I told you before, at the time, I didn't know any black people, I didn't know any Jews, I knew one Catholic. One. I mean, that's the culture in which I grew up, right?
You know what? You have come a long way.
Carolyn says, you've come a long way, baby. Yeah. Look at me now. Yeah, what would Oklahoma think of me now? Well, I've often said that I could not get invited to lead in silent prayer at my home church, so.
Mark, I just did a program, and I'm keeping up with, they found in the middle of the Amazon forest, just two men. That's all there was of this tribe, and the language they spoke, nobody has ever been able to find out what it is. They can't understand it. This man has spent 2 decades with this one who's left, and one passed away, trying to put together what their language means, because only that one person is.
Could y'all hear what Shirley's saying? So she's talking about the thing that's been reported where in the Amazon,
Forest.
they found a culture that consists of 2 surviving men who speak a language no one else speaks.
And he's trying to find out about his faith, his religion, and he's learning one word at a time what it means, and this has been going on for 20 years.
So this is a 20-year phenomenon. But let me just say, here's the point. This kind of thing used to be the norm, that we were exploring new worlds, we were finding new people, finding new cultures, and the whole thing of missions was getting the Christian gospel to all these places where it never reached, right? Ann?
Well, I've been watching this program on Secret Discovery, or KRA, called Expedition Unknown, and it's archaeologists traveling the world seeking out things, strange things. But the interesting thing I find about it is last week he was in Peru, and those people go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But what I find interesting is that every place he goes, whatever tribe or whatever, there's always some kind of God.
Always, right. Wherever you go, there's someone being worshipped, something or someone, right? Okay, John, I have a favor to ask. I don't have a watch on today. When we get to like 25, 20 till, would you give me the cutoff sign? Some of y'all be careful with that cutoff sign. Watch your hands and fingers. Yeah. I know how to read that stuff. Okay. So I want to talk about we've defined 2 ends of the pole here. One of those being, again, that all religious roads lead to the same place, right? So you're in a world where there are lots of doors you can go through on faith, but they all dump into the same river, right? That's the ultimate expression of inclusivity, right? And you've heard people say this, well, I just believe that all religions lead to the same place, right? This is the thing. The other extreme of that is to say Christianity is the only way. But don't forget, or maybe know if you've never known, Christianity is not the only one to make that claim. So hold on to your hat for that. Here's a first variation on this. And that is that some, but not all religions lead to the same place. Okay? So this is most commonly expressed with those who would say that Judaism and Christianity both lead to God in slightly different ways, right? Others might even go so far as to say Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all the 3 great monotheistic religions, all lead to God, but not in this, but exclude Hinduism and Buddhism and other things that are not monotheistic, right? And there are reasons for that. But I want you to see this as a possible variation. Again, I'm not advocating for it, I'm explaining it. Some Christians adopt this position sort of by default because they don't know how else to answer the question of how God will fulfill God's own divine promise to Jews as the chosen people, right? So we have this troublesome little verse in Romans 11:26 that says, all Israel will be saved. What does Scripture mean by Israel in that case? And so there is a common view in evangelical Christianity that somehow by the end of time, all Jews will be saved and brought into understanding of relationship either by confessing Jesus at some point or somehow, or by some other means with that. Now, I want to teach you a big, nasty word here. It's called supersessionism. And I've spelled it in a handout for you here. Supersessionism. This is an interesting concept. It's a fancy way of saying that Christianity supersedes Judaism and replaces it. Now, this is a very common teaching in Christianity, and I'm not saying it's necessarily totally wrong. I want you to see some dangers in it. So this is also known as replacement theology. So the idea is the Jews, the children of Israel, were given a divine mandate by God to be a light to the nations and to proclaim God's name to the nations. They didn't live up to God's expectations for that, and therefore God sent Jesus to be the rescue agent, to pick up what the Jews had not done fully and to school them a little bit and say, now we're creating a new thing that's a greater extension of that, and Christianity is the new expression of Judaism and therefore supersedes it.
Okay, so I've heard this before, but then there was another sentence saying, if that's so, then Islam supersedes Christianity, because when you look on the timeline,
That's right.
And so the danger in that is that then you have to go to the second sentence that says Muslims.
Can y'all hear that? So this is indeed the fact that Islam does the same thing. And their view is that God didn't get through to the Jews, God didn't get through to the Christians, so God spoke to Allah. And Islam is the third iteration of this. Now, I will say also this is an important element of understanding Mormonism, which is not mainstream Christianity, but is a different branch and expression of Christianity. That also, Joseph Smith's whole thing is that the Christian church had forgotten the true will of God, and when he found these golden plates and was spoken to by the angel Moroni, that it was all explained, and the church was reconstituted in what we know today as the Latter-day Saints. So there are multiple iterations of this. That's just two. So the whole idea of supersessionism was really, really popular and absolutely almost unquestioned until World War II. And the Holocaust changed everything, because it was out of this kind of theological teaching that the Holocaust happened. To be able to claim that God had forsaken God's chosen people in favor of Christianity, and therefore it was God's will. It was not only okay, but it was God's will to persecute those who had killed Christ. So there is the dark side of supersessionism. It's a conundrum, right? So back to the main issue of this. I forgot to say, I've given you a quote here. Islamic tradition sees Islam, and I've given you some direct quotes here, as the final and most authentic expression of Abrahamic prophetic monotheism superseding, there's the word, both Jewish and Christian teachings. There's a doctrine called tarif in Islam that teaches that earlier monotheistic scriptures or their interpretations have been corrupted, while the Quran presents a pure version of the divine message that was originally contained. You may not have known that about Islam. That is one way to read the Quran. Okay, so are you with me so far that there is a way to think about this, to say that, all right, we're going to bring in Judaism and Christianity as a way to God, then maybe we're going to bring in Islam as a way to God, but only those three, right? Francis? Belief in one God. So mono, one, theism, belief in God. And Judaism, Christianity, Islam are the three great monotheistic religions because I'm going to use the word religions loosely here because Hinduism would not consider itself to be a religion in the same way that we would define others. It's a practice more than a religion. It's a culture, right? So that's the distinction there. Now, here's another variation. And this goes to the other extreme on this. And that is that only certain branches of Christianity lead to God. All right, so within Christianity, there's a subset of Christians who believe they alone are the chosen ones. Right? Now, this is the very rootage of the formation of the churches of Christ, which is rooted, just a little history here, in something called landmarkism that you've heard me talk about before. Now we're into good stuff here, right? Landmarkism was rampant in this part of America in the 19th century, and it came out of Baptist roots with a guy named Alexander Campbell who taught that the only true church was the constituted local church. He did not believe in a larger church, but only the authority of the particular local church. And so if you, for example, were raised in a culture where you were not allowed to take communion in someone else's church, that is due to landmarkism, right? So that idea permeated many Baptist churches in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri, around this region as well. But it also eventually led to a split, and this also was Kentucky and Tennessee. It also led to a split where some Baptist churches pulled away from their Baptist identity and created this new thing that became the Churches of Christ. Side note, the Christian church, Disciples of Christ, was a break-off from that went the other direction and came back more to where we are, which is why Christian church, Disciples of Christ, and Baptists like us are pretty much kissing cousins, right? We just went through a different family tree to get there. So there are certainly sects within Christianity and that preach that they are the only true way, and this includes some independent fundamentalist Baptists and others, like those who believe you got to use only the King James Bible, and if you don't, you're an apostate, right? You got to believe in 12 things, or you're an apostate, right? This also happens in cults. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, a non-Christian cult that believes they alone are the elect. Carol Ann.
I don't know if I'm the devil's advocate or what, but don't you think that Satan must be really happy about all of this? Because if he creates chaos and confusion, then no one's going to believe. I mean, you can go to one extreme or the other. You can believe in everything, or you can believe in one thing.
Or you can believe in nothing.
Or you can believe in nothing. And in that case, then God only knows where you're going. So
Carol Ann is making the point that this is certainly plays into a satanic plot to cause confusion, right? To stir the pot and cause people to doubt, which is certainly a valid point. I mean, gosh, we see this in so many areas of life the best way to get advantage over your opponent is to divide and to confuse, right? Just divert, right? And this could be a grand cosmic diversion.
Only if you allow that confusion to harden you or silence you or make you shout, or maybe I should say, make you not listen. If it causes you to come to the table and have a conversation, and be open about it, then I think it doesn't do that. So I think it's the way you approach it.
The way you approach it, okay.
Is what, because I'm confused about it, but I think I'm using it, asking questions, coming to the table.
So there is a way to see the confusion and seek answers that are redemptive, not divisive.
Yes, but Shannon is very smart, and I'm not. I'm not convinced that there are a whole lot of.
Carol Ann believes Shannon is very smart. I'll just repeat that part. Yeah. Yes, Donna.
Wasn't this part of the problem with the breakup with the SBC back in the 80s and 90s and so forth over inerrancy of the scripture? Because there are some SBC churches out there that thinks that CBF and other American Baptists, we're going straight to hell because we don't believe exactly like they do.
Yeah, so fundamentalism by its very nature is ever more exclusive. It's ever narrowing the field because there's got to be tremendous purity, right? And we see this in theological and political and sociological movements as well, where true purists believe that only they and the people like them. You never run into someone who thinks they're not among the elect. Have you noticed that? It's a bit of a curiosity.
But do you think something like the computer died against the computer? But we are, Caroline is almost as smart as Shannon because she can read things on the I mean, really.
So
when
that's
you
part of the
were
globalization, right?
You were told something and you had said it, and when you were a teenager.
Well, I might go read about it in the World Book Encyclopedia, right? That was about the extent of what I could do.
Church, you were told that,
Right.
and
Now we have access to a lot more information. You can go Google it,
right.
right? And that doesn't always lead you to truth, but anyhow. Number 3 on the continuum, and I'm sure there are others I'm not addressing, this is the idea that there's a differentiation between faith systems that lead to the worship of God by whatever name versus those that lead to the worship of idols. Now this may sound a lot like point 1, but I want to draw some distinction here because all 3 of the great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, forbid idol worship. So one of the ways that Christianity, for example, criticizes other religions is to say, well, they're just worshiping idols. So Buddhism, Buddha is an idol, right? Hinduism, nature is an idol. And we go down the list here. So the book that I'm citing here says, it is abundantly clear that biblical religion is opposed to idolatry. The source of this prohibition is the monotheistic belief that God is beyond compare. The prohibition is there in the founding story of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, the second of which is, you shall not make for yourself an idol, Exodus 24. And Islam, of course, is well known for its similar strong prohibition on idols, association of material things with Allah being perhaps the greatest of human faults. Christian tradition, too, has a strong aversion to idol worship, an attitude inherited from Judaism. So the problem, we can acknowledge that, yes, there's a prohibition against idolatry, but we got to define what's an idol.
Well, there are plenty of Christians that have idols, let me tell you.
So here's a problem, right? We happy free church Protestants think we have no idols. And the truth is, I think most everyone has some kind of idol, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Protestants, some Protestants believe Catholics practice idol worship because of praying to saints and statues and using prayer beads and these other tactile things. Likewise, some Protestants accuse Orthodox Christians of idol worship because they use icons in worship as an important thing. So, quoting Alan Race again, to mistake the materially obvious for the mysteriously transcendent is the essence of idolatry. But that is not what is happening in what Westerners have pejoratively called idolatry. Let me point that out. To mistake the materially obvious for the mysteriously transcendent is the essence of idolatry, but that is not what is happening in what Westerners have pejoratively called idolatry. So, to try to explain this idea a little bit, we who are not of a tradition of using statues or saints as a way to think about God immediately see, say, a Catholic or an Orthodox practice as substituting that item for God, so that you are praying to the statue of the Virgin or to the statue of Jesus on the cross. Whereas those who practice that belief, or to the icon in worship, use those as a gateway, as a prompt, as a tool, right? It's not that they believe that statue is God, but they believe that statue reminds them and gives them a prompt to make it to God. The same way you might, in Christian practice, say, light a candle to help you center if you practice centering prayer. Or you might use a labyrinth, like we have in the columbarium, to help you as a tool. But true evangelical, the kind of place we've all come from, sees all of that as unnecessary because it's all a temptation to believe in something other than God.
That's called scaffolding in education.
It's called, say again?
Scaffolding.
Scaffolding.
In education.
What does that mean?
It means giving you a prompt to get to where you're going.
Okay, so it's a help, it's an aid.
Like mind mapping.
Yes, Carla.
I was always taught praying to Mary was kind of in that category because she's not God.
Yeah, so when you pray to Mary, right, Shannon?
Well, so I've had a lot of people, because I was raised Catholic, you pray to Mary, and I can tell you, at least from the parish I grew up in, I had 2 different parishes, I was never taught, I was never informed. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I'm like, what are you talking about? I always saw it intercessory or something a little bit more relatable because God wasn't that relatable. God is God. So, but some people would always say, no, you're making that your idol or you're praying, and I'm like, that's not the case necessarily. It can be with some, but
Right.
it just never entered my.
So I'll give another example from our culture. One of the pieces Jeff is playing during communion today is one of my favorite pieces of all time in classical music, Elgar's Nimrod variation. And it's one of those things that has a transcendent ability to sort of make a spiritual connection for me. So when I listen to that music, am I idolizing the organ or the player of the organ, or am I using that and letting that be a spiritual tool to help me connect with God? That's something we more easily understand. Now, I know I'm running short on time. Let me press forward. Here is, how much time do I have? 8 minutes. Okay. We increasingly have interfaith dialogue and interfaith or intercultural experiences today. You may have neighbors who are from a different culture or a different religion. You probably work with people from other cultures and religions. Dallas is certainly much more urbane than it was 50 years ago, and we have so many cultures who've come here. So, an example is given in this book. When Christians visit a Hindu temple in a modern Western city, should they receive the prasad, which is often offered to visitors? This is sacred temple food. It does not, in Hinduism, have the same connotation as communion to us, but it still is something that's been offered in Hindu worship and it's eaten by people who are there, right? It is a generous gift to give you as a guest. So if you partake of that, are you worshiping an idol?
Well, then what is your definition of worship? If I am just being gracious and receiving or taking something, but it doesn't have any power, influence, or effect on me, like my faith has a foundation.
Right.
That's,
So Shannon, say if this doesn't have an effect on me, that's different than if I'm partaking with some expectation that this is a worship experience for me. It's a cultural experience, right?
But what about when the Bible tells us do not bow down before an idol? And if you go somewhere where, they put their hands like in prayer or they bow their head, is that wrong for you as a Christian?
So would you kiss the Pope's ring if you met him in an audience?
No, I would not.
I would see him. I would.
Okay, so that's an easy example of that. Yes.
Actually, if you go to these things, if you go to a Hindu service, if you have an audience with the Pope, if you're gonna act like an ass, don't go.
Just for the record, I didn't say that. I don't disagree with it, but I didn't say it.
While we were in Hawaii, we visited a Hindu temple. It's an active Hindu temple. Well, they require you to take your shoes. Well, anyway,
Yeah, Buddhist, huh?
So we took our shoes off in reverence of their custom. Then we went through, some people lit the incense and stuff like that.
Right.
Some people were worshiping their God. It meant that we might have been doing something for ourselves,
Yeah, fair enough. Yes.
I think the sin of worshiping idols, even in the Scripture, like when Abraham was up on the mountain and they built idols, the sin of worship was actually because they did not believe God was going to provide, and so they were seeking provision from idols. So it's really about the distrust of God, or saying God.
Yes. Yes, and this leads to my next 3 points. I'm going to end with these. They're right in the middle of this third page. How do we understand the meaning of idolatry? Number one, idolatry is the worship of that which is not God as God. Idolatry is substituting something that is not God in place of God, making a swap, right? I don't believe God is going to rescue me, so let's build a golden calf so we can have something to worship, all right? Number two, idolatry is, in its true sense, is the substitution of the infinite, transcendent power and authority which is God by other objects which are merely finite but yet have acquired an equivalent transcendent status. That is a long sentence. That's why I gave it to you in writing, right? And then the third thing is a question. Might it also be possible for the Christian church to confuse its conception of God with God per se? So the question here is it possible that as we develop our own theology and our own belief system and practices, that we can worship the practice more than the person? And I think the answer to that we all know is absolutely yes. If you've ever been in a church for very long, you've run into someone who is in love with the process or the program.
Don't change it.
Right? Or the carpet or whatever, right? So that becomes the paramount thing to God and in effect replaces God. All right, so we're going to end right there with idolatry for today. And where we will pick up next week is with the line that says, now back to the concept of pluralism, right? We got halfway as far as I wanted to get today. There's a really interesting C.S. Lewis quote that we're going to get to. Also, have any of you read the novel The Life of Pi?
Oh, it's so good.
Okay, so I've got a reference to that in here because if you want to go sort of brush up on that, Pi is a character who tries to find good things in 3 religions and is told he can't, right? So we're going to talk about that as well. Thanks for your great participation today, and we'll say goodbye to our live stream audience at this point and move into our prayer time. We're so glad that you joined us in Discovery Class via live stream today, and we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us in person, we would love to meet you as well. We meet every Sunday morning, about 9:45, 9:50, in the parlor at Wilshire Baptist Church, 4316 Abrams Road here in Dallas. If you'd like to know more about Wilshire, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.